Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I am reviewing this custom sword made by Maciej Kopciuch of Art of Swordmaking. Now this is a custom sword. I ordered it from him, and I will go over that ordering process in just a minute. This sword ended up costing right around $2,500 when you include the scabbard, the conversion rate from euro to US dollars, etc. About $2,500. So that's what I'm going to be reviewing it as in this sword, $2,500 for the sword and scabbard. So let's talk about Mr. Kopciuch, the ordering process, the inspiration for this sword, the fulfillment, all that kind of stuff before we get into the review of the actual sword. I have reviewed one other sword from Mr. Kopciuch. I will link it up here and in the description. Now, when I wanted this sword to be made, I had seen a piece of original artwork from the medieval period, which I will put up on screen as well. And I liked it, but I wanted a longsword version of it. And so I reached out to Mr. Kopciuch thinking he would be a good person to take that pretty basic image and convert it to a longsword and do his thing with it. He has a very specific style and look to his swords that captures the medieval aesthetic very, very well. So I thought he would be a good person for this. What I reached out to him about is I wanted a sword inspired by that picture, a longsword version. I said probably 16A would be the closest Oakeshott typology. The things that I really wanted to make sure were included were the double fullers, this rain flap, shape, whatever you want to call it, a pommel in this general shape. I wanted the brass coin inlaid in there, and then a crossguard of this shape. That was pretty much what I wanted out of the general commission. There were a few other details that I added in there, and I'm going to talk about them later because there's things to talk about with them. But that was the basic request of my commission. I originally reached out to him on Facebook Messenger, and then once the discussion passed the preliminary stage, we moved to email. And it was in email that I listed out all of my requirements. So I placed the order in June of 2022 with the estimated completion around June to August of 2023. So about a year, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. Mr. Kopciuch said that if it did not have a scabbard, it would have been probably the same year, but the scabbards take additional time. In addition, he said he already had a blade, crossguard, and pommel made that he could use on this commission. So that was kind of cool. I got to see a few pictures of that. He did say he would provide me more pictures throughout the creation process. That didn't happen. I never got pictures until I asked for them. So around August, or I think it was more like September of last year, 2023, after the completion date had already passed, I reached out asking for updates. And he said he'd had some injuries and some delays, and I expected the sword to be delayed because of that. And it was delayed. But he didn't really give me any updated estimate of when it would be completed. So a couple months went by, I reached out again. He told me he has to do them one by one in order. And a few times that happened until around December, where he said that it should be done by the end of the year. Well, the end of the year came, it still wasn't done. I think it was around February or March of 2024 that he did finally complete the sword and sent it to me. I want to point out that when I received the sword, this was the best packaged sword I have ever received. He managed to cram it between two very thick, very soft and absorbent foam blocks in the box, and it was not moving anywhere. It took me a good 5 minutes to get it out of the box once I opened it up because of how tightly and well packaged it was. So serious kudos to Mr. Kopciuch for getting it that well packaged. When you're getting a sword from across an ocean, you like to see that. Now, there has been some discussion about Mr. Kopciuch and his business practices and stuff that I don't really want to get into in this review, except how it pertains to this sword, which we will get to as we come to it throughout the review. But if you're interested, after watching this review, I highly recommend you check out Kane Shen's video in which he discussed at length Mr. Kopciuch and his marketing and business practices and just a whole variety of things. So I will link that up here and in the description. I will try to timestamp it to the exact part where he starts talking about Mr. Kopciuch, because this is a video where he's doing the tier ranking of Euro sword manufacturers, and Mr. Kopciuch is just one of them. So if you haven't seen that video, I do highly recommend checking it out, but after you watch this review. All right, let's kick off the meat and bones of this review by looking at the scabbard. But first I should say how much the scabbard cost. The scabbard, it added, I don't know the exact amount it added to the commission because I never got a specific price breakdown, but it was around 700 to 800 euros added to the cost of the sword commission. And I am happy to pay that kind of price for a very good scabbard, because good scabbards are very time and labor intensive, and therefore they cost more. So this is an absolutely gorgeous scabbard, and it's actually got a little bit more to it than I originally requested. I asked for a relatively plain scabbard, maybe a little bit of decoration. When the commission was almost done, Mr. Kopciuch reached out to me saying such and asked a little bit more about what I wanted for the scabbard, like color and stuff. I pretty much said, I leave it up to you. He offered to do a little bit more decoration to it than what I already requested. I think personally as something of an apology for how long the commission took. I don't know, that's my hunch, but what he did here is just absolutely gorgeous. Let's start with the belt. It's got these really nice fittings on it. These conchos, I believe this is a tongue, a nice buckle on here. The belt feels of good quality leather and just looks really good also. And then the decorations on the scabbard are beautiful. If we look here, as I slowly unwrap the belt, you can see just so much detail here. Now, it's important to mention this is not hand tooling. This is a stamped pattern, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just pointing it out because I have seen this exact pattern on several other of Mr. Kopciuch's swords. Again, that's not an issue or a problem or anything, just something I'm pointing out. It's also got this really beautiful bronze chape on here that I really like. I originally did request a chape. I originally said steel. Mr. Kopciuch suggested bronze because that is more historically accurate. That's what he said, and I was happy to oblige that because I love the way bronze looks. So overall, this scabbard is just gorgeous. I love the way it looks. Moving on to the functionality of the scabbard, you can see here that the sword doesn't quite fit in the scabbard perfectly. The rain guard kind of covers up the fact that it doesn't slide all the way in. And it is currently in the way it slides further in. When I switch it around, you'll see it doesn't quite fit in quite as well there either. If we shake it, it's kind of hard to shake without the belt making noise. There is very little rattle. There's a tiny bit there, but very, very little. That's a pretty good fit there. Hold it upside down, shake. It does come out eventually, but it takes quite a bit of shaking to get it out. If I flip it around now, it has a tiny bit more rattle. If you look there, hopefully you can see it doesn't fit in quite as well. Still quite a good fit though. And yeah, it's not really, it does come out eventually if I hold it upside down and shake, but if I just hold it upside down, it doesn't come out at all. So overall, it's a well-fitted scabbard. Incidentally, I didn't mention this during the aesthetics. It is slender, which I really like. It's a very nice and well-designed and well-implemented piece that is only as big and as thick as it needs to be to do the job, which is the way a scabbard should be. So let's take a look at the hilt on this sword, starting with the pommel. This would be a Oakeshott type J pommel with a recess in it. And in that recess are these little brass coins, which were part of the commission. I wanted a brass coin with a cross put into it. Even though I'm not religious, I like to have that because it's very reminiscent of what would have been there historically. Christianity was incredibly important to the medieval people. So this kind of iconography is very commonly found on medieval swords. That's why I wanted it there. And it looks beautiful. I really do love those coin inserts. Now, those aren't made by Mr. Kopciuch. He outsources those to a friend of his. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but I think they look absolutely great. The entire pommel looks really nice. It's got very clean lines throughout. There is a little bit of a rustic look to it, which is a very common thing with Mr. Kopciuch's work. It is definitely part of his aesthetic, his style, to have a little bit more of a rustic look, something that showcases some of the flaws that you would oftentimes see in the historical swords. Although, while there are little flaws here and there in his work, it's still, the fit and finish is still much higher than at least the vast majority of historical swords would have been. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting about this is there's not really much taper to this center ridge here. There might be a tiny bit in terms of thickness, but if there is, it's very, very minor. And this the center boss isn't angled at all, which you would typically see on Type J pommels, but because of the recess in there, I think it makes sense that it's not. But overall, it's a beautiful pommel, and all of the edges are chamfered very, very nicely. There's no hot spots anywhere on this pommel at all. And if we look at the peen, this is another hallmark of Mr. Kopciuch's work. His peens are a little rough looking. He doesn't polish up the peen after doing it. It's blackened here from the heat and the hammering and all that stuff. There's no errant hammer marks here. It's very, very well done. The craftsmanship is undeniable here, but it is a little rougher finished. That's what he likes to see. Moving on to the grip. This is your typical wood core leather wrap and a cord impression on it. I don't think there's any cord underneath the leather. Sometimes you will find that on some historic or some European-inspired medieval style swords, but it doesn't feel like it is on this one, and that's fine. The leatherwork is really, really nice here. All the risers are very crisp and well-defined. The cord texture is really beautiful. The seam does wander around a little bit, but it is skived over perfectly, and there's absolutely no hot spots anywhere on there. It is a bit of a thick, wide grip. It's wider than I'm used to in this dimension, and then fairly thin in this dimension. So it feels I feel that width in the hand. I will talk about that more in the handling section. But there's also a little bit of a swell in thickness out towards these risers, and then a bit of a taper in here. And it doesn't really taper in width here at all, and then does up towards the pommel. It's a really beautiful grip. I like the color on here. It's like kind of an oxblood, but the grip is the first place that Mr. Kopciuch did deviate from my commission. When I originally commissioned this, I asked for the grip to be octagonal in cross-section, very much like the Albion Steward, which I'll put up on screen here. I really like that style of grip, and I wanted it on this sword because I really like it. And I ended up with something that's much more elliptical. I would have definitely preferred the octagonal shape that I requested. In addition, I had asked for something like a bright color on the grip. I wasn't sure, maybe a red. I ended up with oxblood. I don't really mind that though, because later on in the commission, he did ask me again about the grip color, and I pretty much left it up to him. I said, whatever you think works best. And the oxblood definitely works very, very well here. So while I did originally request something bright, I think this oxblood color is perfectly good and works very well with this sword, and I have no complaints about it. I do have a bit of a complaint about the grip not being the shape that I wanted. That seems like a minor complaint, but when you're paying $2,500 for a sword and scabbard, you really want it to meet your specifications. Moving on to the guard and also these flaps here. Now, what the name for these is kind of up in the air. Most people call them rain flaps. I've seen them called a shape before, even like a thumb flap. I don't really care what it's called. It would be nice to have an official name, but there doesn't seem to be one. I love these on swords, and they are not nearly represented enough in the modern reproduction market. There were a lot of swords historically that had these, and I would really like to see more makers put them on their swords. One of the things I really like about them is that when you are thumbing the blade, you're not touching the blade with your thumb. It's protecting the sword from your skin oils. That's a nice thing. It's a little bit less maintenance to do on the blade of the sword. Now, this one, when I commissioned it from Mr. Kopciuch, I just said I wanted these flaps on there, and I gave him some pictures of other ones he had done to kind of go with the design and let him choose the design of them. The leather work here is outstanding. I love the design he put on here. There's some stitching on the back right here to keep it together. Actually, it's only on this side, so you can see it was put on and then stitched up like that. I love these rain flaps, whatever you want to call them. I think they are outstanding, they look great, and they're functional, and they're a great addition to the sword. Now, if we move on to the crossguard itself, this is what I would call a Type 5 crossguard with some decorative filing done on the end to give it a little bit more aesthetic flair. Again, this is very much what I requested. If you look at that picture that I took inspiration from for this sword, the very tip ends of the quillins do have this kind of cutout in them. So once again, I think Mr. Kopciuch nailed the look of that I wanted. This is exactly the type of crossguard I wanted. And because this, I kind of envisioned this sword, and I think Mr. Kopciuch did too, as kind of a 16A in that general time frame and blade geometry. A lot of those swords had pretty short crossguards in history, and this is a pretty short crossguard, so it fits that styling and that type, and I think it just looks outstanding. This really does capture the look that I was going for. The finish is very much like the pommel. There's a little bit of rusticness to it, some spots here and there. It's not a problem in my book, but it is what you get from Mr. Kopciuch. If you're considering ordering from him, be aware of stuff like that because it is his style. Now, if we look at the gap in the crossguard, you can see it's definitely not particularly well fitted to the blade. But again, this is something that Mr. Kopciuch does. If you look at historical swords, I would say the majority of them did not have really tight fitted gaps in the blades. It's something that we've come to expect on modern reproductions, and there were historical swords that had very good gaps there. It's something that, like I said, we've come to expect there, but it's not really a sign of quality per se, so much as an aesthetic choice and something that requires extra time on the maker's part. Mr. Kopciuch believes that his swords should be able to fit in aesthetically with historical swords, so it does kind of make sense that the gap is a little bit larger than we would normally see. It doesn't really bother me. I do like to see a tighter gap, but I understand his point of view, and I can definitely get behind that and agree with that concept. And in addition, because it has these little flaps, whatever they are, you don't really see the gap in the blade or in the crossguard pretty much at all, so that aesthetic is less important. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. Now, unusually, I am not going to talk about the measurements yet. I'm going to come back to them after I talk about the aesthetics of the blade and the sword in general, overall, really. This is one of the prettiest sword blades I have in my collection, bar none. There is so much craftsmanship and attention to detail and just a really keen artist's eye to this blade that it is a stunning blade. The double fullers are gorgeously put in. The overall finish is a very even satin that still has some flaws in it. That's Mr. Kopciuch's style. The overall blade profile is just perfect. It looks so beautiful. I love the aesthetics of this sword so much. I can't even begin to explain just how pretty I find this sword. Now there are, like I said, some flaws in the finish and flaws in the sword. Aside from little spots on the blade where the polish is not quite as even, and there's some black spots and just stuff that you oftentimes won't see on other high-end makers. For instance, the Damian Solowski, also a Polish smith, he puts the most incredible finish I've seen on a sword where it is even and smooth and buttery perfect. That's not the case here, but this looks authentically medieval, as if it were maintained perfectly from a medieval period. To my eye, obviously I haven't studied historic swords, so I can't say that with 100-degree certainty, but it definitely, to me, captures the look and feel of the medieval aesthetic. Now, if we look towards the tip, it's definitely a little bit asymmetrical and not perfectly formed up there. Again, this is something you have to expect if you're going to order from Mr. Kopciuch. You are not going to get perfect lines and perfect symmetry, anything like that. That's not his style. I knew that going in. So when I see something like the tip being very slightly not symmetrical, doesn't bother me at all. In addition, one thing I really like is how the sword bevels to the edge. There is a noticeable apple-seated geometry to it that really works nicely. It is definitely apple-seated. It almost looks like a secondary bevel, but it's not. It's an apple seating, and the polish is actually pretty well blended into the rest of the blade. It looks very, very nice, and the aesthetic just works. I love how this sword looks. Now, the one thing I dislike, and actually dislike is too strong of a word, the one complaint I have with the aesthetics of the sword is that in my first email where I laid out what I wanted for the sword, I asked for 3 crosses to be spaced throughout the double fullers. And I took a picture of a sword that he had done before showing the type of crosses I wanted done. Just like with the coin in the pommel, it's something that to me screams medieval, is to have crosses in various places on the sword. So I really wanted them on here. Well, when the sword was done and he showed me pictures, they were missing. I asked about them. He basically said he had overlooked that in the commission. He did not notice that I requested that, and said that they wouldn't work on this sword because of the double fullers. Not wanting to argue or start a complaint or anything, I just wanted the sword at this point. I didn't say anything. I said, okay, it's fine, send me the sword. But I don't understand that. Not only is it done on modern swords like this one, it's also done on historic swords like this one. I don't understand why it would not work on this sword. And it is disappointing that that detail got missed. I would have really liked to see them on here. All right, coming back to the measurements. This sword starts at 4.5 millimeters at the crossguard, and for about the first half of the blade or so, it only distally tapers a little bit, about 0.5 millimeter. And then once you get past the fullers, it starts tapering more aggressively down to about 2.3 millimeters right before the tip, which is not reinforced. Now, that's thin for this type of sword. You will oftentimes see that type of thickness on earlier medieval single-handed swords with much wider blades. Later medieval, which this would be, we're talking 14th into early 15th century, those era of swords tended to have thicker blades for more rigidity. Now, 4.5 millimeters at the base is not outside the historical record. There were absolutely swords of this general type that started that thin. And Mr. Kopciuch seems to like making his swords a bit on the thinner side. That's his choice. It's again within the historical record. However, the problem is the listing that he put up for this sword, or not the listing, but the stats he put up for this sword say that it starts at 6 millimeters thick. No, it does not. It is 4.5 millimeters thick. There is no way it gets all the way up to 6 millimeters thick. And here we're going to touch on one of the things that Kane Shen talked about in his video, and that's misrepresenting stats, because it does not start at 6 millimeters thick. And fairly recently, Mr. Kopciuch put up an article where he said the thickness can be measured at the crossguard, or it could also be measured inside the crossguard or at the tang. I've never heard of anybody ever measuring it anywhere except at the crossguard, because once the sword's assembled, you can't do that. Sure, if it's a museum piece with the grip rotted away or anything like that, sure, you can measure the tang, but nobody's doing that on a modern completed sword. In addition, I know for a fact this sword is not 6 millimeters thick at the tang. How do I know that? Because I got a set of feeler gauges which let me measure the gap in the crossguard. And overall, the gap measures 5.5 millimeters thick. You can't slide the guard up a 6 millimeter tang if the slot in the guard is 5.5 millimeters thick. There is no way this sword is 6 millimeters thick at any part of the blade. And it is disingenuous for Mr. Kopciuch to represent it any other way. I don't know why he does this unless it is... I don't know why he does this. It is misrepresented. The stats are incorrect. Every other stat that he has on his website is bang on for what I measured, except the thickness. It is a full 1.5 millimeters difference, and this is a pattern for Mr. Kopciuch, and it is unacceptable in my opinion. Now again, I'm not saying that Mr. Kopciuch can't make swords at this thickness. It's perfectly fine if that's what he wants to make. That's his choice. It is perfectly fine. It does affect the cutting and handling ability. We'll talk about that later. But if that's what he wants to make, that's fine. I didn't discuss thickness during the commission at all. I left it up to him. And if he would just list his swords at the correct thickness that they actually are, I wouldn't even be talking about this whole part. I would just mention the sword's a rather thin sword, and we'll talk about how that affects how it's used. But the fact that he consistently misrepresents the thickness on his swords is a pattern, and it's problematic. Just own the type of swords that you make, and there would be a lot less controversy. Now, one last thing to talk about before getting into the sharpness of the sword, and it is about the sharpness. After Mr. Kopciuch had published an article discussing how sharp medieval swords were, and his thought seeming to be that they were not particularly sharp, it was more about having robust edges that could impact armor, I reached out to him and explained that for this commission, I wanted a sword that could cut gambeson, textile armor, something sharp enough that it could effectively cut an unarmored person, with the idea of this being a nobleman's sword who would use it for self-defense and maybe for a duel without any armor, that kind of thing. That's what I requested from him. And you'll see in a minute how sharp it is, but I will say the edge is very fine, and it could use to be stropped. It's a little bit toothy, but not too much. But let's see how it does on paper and then on my normal targets. All right, let's take a look at the edge and see how it cuts paper. Now, I want to say I'm doing this not to test the edge per se, but to demonstrate the level of sharpness on the sword so that you have more context to the cutting footage you're going to be seeing in just a minute. Again, this is not about whether the sword can cut the paper, but how it does, how the edge compares to other swords you've seen me cut with. Now, that being said, I do think the sword should be sharp enough to cut paper, so let's see how it cuts the paper. So it kind of stalled in one spot there without ever tearing, but then sliced right through very easily. Let's try that one more time. There might be a slightly less sharp area right around here where it's dulling, and then there it started tearing a little bit. but that's not bad. Let's test the other edge. Pretty much the same thing. It starts the cut, kind of stalls a little bit, and then cuts through. So overall, a pretty dang sharp sword. Definitely sharp enough to slice paper, definitely sharp enough to cut in the backyard, and I would say definitely sharp enough. And this is a bit of a spoiler for the cutting section. I didn't actually test it against any cloth-covered targets, but I think it is... Mr. Kopciuch definitely delivered on the sharpness that I requested out of this sword. The amount of cutting I've done, cutting paper, I can tell that this level of sharpness is sufficient to at least cut into cloth decently. All right, let's talk about cutting. And I'm going to start this section off. I think this is a good time to address why I cut the targets I cut. You know, I do paper cutting. I already talked about that. Water bottles, pool noodles, and tatami. I'll go through those in order. Water bottles, I cut them because they are fun, plentiful, and I can recycle them. That's pretty much it. There's also some variety there. There's different types of water bottles that provide different levels of resistance. Milk jugs offer oftentimes a very good target for multi-cut combos, and more like paper stock containers, that kind of thing, are often actually fairly tough because paper, as I talk about, often is not particularly easy to cut. So that's why I cut those. Pool noodles, well, I don't really cut pool noodles that often anymore, but they are a good test of sharpness and edge alignment and speed. Those are the three things you really want for cutting pool noodles. You can get away with failing on one of those if the other two make up for it. But they're kind of a inexpensive version of tatami in a way, except none of the resistance of tatami. However, I don't particularly like cutting them anymore because they both leave a lot of scuffs on the blade and they're not recyclable. So I'm just creating waste, and I don't really like doing that. The last is tatami, and I like cutting tatami first off because it's a competition material. It's what is used in competition cutting, so it's something I can judge myself against, seeing how really good cutters cut on the tatami and how I compare to them. And it's frankly fun to cut tatami. Now, it's also expensive. You know, at the best price, one roll is $5, $6, usually more like $8 to $10 or maybe even more. So that's why I generally only do one tatami mat per review, because as is, I'm already losing money on doing one tatami mat per review. YouTube does not pay me that much. So I have to budget those out. But anyways, that's kind of beside the point. So that's why I cut those targets, the ones that I do. And why am I bringing this up? Well, Mr. Kopciuch has penned, from what I remember, 2 to 3 articles talking about using swords, and in particular his swords, on these modern targets. And from what I have gleaned from these articles, again, this is my interpretation of his writing, he does not like his swords, or really any swords, being used on the targets I cut. He seems to hold cutting those targets with disdain. Well, this is my sword. They're what I cut. I'm a backyard cutter. I cut them anyways. That's what I cut. It's what I do. So one of the reasons I'm continuing to cut those with this sword when Mr. Kopciuch, the maker of the sword, doesn't think they're appropriate targets is because they are my standard targets. So in terms of this review, you can see how this sword cuts those targets compared to other swords that I have also cut those targets with. You also have to take into account my skill level. I am hopefully improving my technique here and getting better, so you do have to do some adjustment for that. But it at least gives you an idea of how this sword cuts compared to others I have reviewed. So as you saw from the footage that I played while talking about that, you see that this sword didn't really cut that well. And I want to say that was every single cut I have done with this sword. I didn't edit any out. I didn't pick specific ones to put in. I just put in every single cut I did with this sword. And it wasn't that many because it wasn't very effective of a cutter. And I should add here that some of the poor cuts were not the sword's fault, much more my fault and my poor technique. But still, even with that said, the sword didn't cut very well. Why is that? Well, it's sharp enough. You saw that it was good enough to cut paper, and just feeling it, it's definitely sharp enough. It does have that little bit of a toothy edge, but that's not a problem. In fact, that can sometimes help with cutting. Why is it not a particularly effective cutter? I'm going to start with tatami. And here there was two things going on. One, I was targeting more around here. And that's where I would normally target with the sword, where to cut with, around 2/3 of the way up the blade. The problem is the sword is quite narrow there. That's actually not the center of percussion. It's more down here. So that threw me for a loop. Most of my cuts, I ended up targeting here, and it didn't cut. It cut deep into the tatami most of the time, but it didn't get all the way through because there's just no meat there. This is such a light blade. It doesn't have any authority in the cut, so there's nothing driving it through. The one cut I got all the way through, and it was a pretty clean cut, it was more back here, and then I also put more oomph into the cut, more acceleration, more power into it. And it did get all the way through. So it's capable of cutting back here, but this isn't a very good place to cut with. If you look at it in terms of blade geometry, it's fine, except that it's halfway up the blade. That means you have to get really close to the target to be able to cut with it there. And that's not really what you want to do. You want to cut, frankly, you want reach. Generally speaking, if we're talking actual battles, actual duels, obviously none of us are going to do that now. But you want your sword to be effective out here, not right in here. Now this could be a thrusting sword, although it's pretty flexible for that. But that's kind of beside the point. Moving on to water bottles. Why did it not particularly cut them that well? Well, it did cut them decently, but because it's so thin, it flexes when I'm swinging it, and that affects edge alignment. When it flexes mid-swing before I impact the target, the sword is going to end up impacting while flexed, and suddenly my edge alignment may not be quite on, and therefore it doesn't actually cut. Now, this is not nearly as flexible as some other swords I've reviewed. It has nothing on the Dark Sword Armory sword. This is far more rigid than that. But it is still a very lightweight and thin sword that does not have much rigidity, and therefore it does not have much ability to power through the cuts. It is capable of delivering good cuts, but it does me no favors whatsoever. In fact, I would say it's not even that it does me no favors. I have to compensate for it to make it be an effective cutter. Most of the time, if I say a sword does me no favors, it means my technique has to be on, but it can still deliver good cuts. Here, I feel like I have to compensate and adjust my technique, adjust my position in order to allow this sword to be able to cut. So I didn't do a lot of targets with it because I just didn't find it to be very fun to cut with. And maybe it would do better against the targets that Mr. Kopciuch prefers to see cut. I believe he would like to see pumpkins and maybe some like a pork roast. And I think he's actually even mentioned covering the roast in mail armor. Well, that's right out. I don't have access to mail armor. I'm not going to buy a thing of mail armor just to test this. Mail armor's entire purpose pretty much is to defeat cuts. So I don't even understand why I would want to cut a target with mail armor. It wouldn't do anything. It would do some blunt impact, although with how lightweight this blade is, there wouldn't be a whole lot of impact. But it wouldn't cut through the mail links, that's for sure. Pumpkin, yeah, that can be fun to cut. I've cut them some. They're not particularly hard to cut, and I don't think they're any better of an analog to human flesh than tatami or anything else. In other words, not really an analog at all. And pumpkins aren't in season right now. I'm trying to grow cantaloupes and some pumpkins in my yard. Unfortunately, we have rabbits all over the place and they just love my garden. So I don't know how successful that will be. Regardless, those aren't the targets I normally cut. I wanted to continue to do the targets I do cut so that you can see how this sword performs compared to other reviews I have done. And in my opinion, it's not a good cutter. All right, let's talk about how this sword handles and do some comparisons for you. First off, this is a light and nimble sword. It is just over 3 pounds, very usable one-handed, comes alive in two. I hold it out there, you can probably see the tip does vibrate a little bit just from holding it out there. And if we look at the percussion nodes, you can see the blade node is right around here, about halfway up the blade. It's a little further back than I am used to on swords. I am used to more like about 2/3 of the way up the blade. Now what that does, when you cut at the percussion node, that's where it's going to be the sweet spot. It's where the blade's going to not vibrate as much as it impacts the target, produce less hand shock for you. Because it's back a little bit further, I'm used to cutting up here. It's a little tricky to cut with it, but then I already talked about cutting. So let's move on from cutting and talk about something else that I noticed. 2 things with the hilt. First off, the percussion node in the hilt is also off a little from where I'm used to. It's right around here, right above this riser. So when I'm gripping it in this hand and there's vibrations going through the sword, it's vibrating more right here. You can actually see the cross guards vibrating there. Right here is where there's no vibrations. I'm feeling those vibrations up here. So it's not the best placed percussion node in the hilt for my taste. And personally, I did notice when cutting, especially on a failed cut, it produces some hand shock. That's my taste, but it's also kind of a norm for swords to have the percussion node, at least for really well-designed swords, and swords that are really optimized for cutting, to have it up a little bit closer to the crossguard so that your main hand doesn't feel those shocks as they travel through the blade. In addition, look, if we look here, I mentioned the grip is a little bit bulky, and I feel that. I can't wrap my hand fully around it. This finger can just barely touch my palm, and it's just a little bulky for my taste, and I don't have as good of a grip on it as I would like. I noticed again when I had some bad cuts with the sword that my grip, I never lost my grip, but my grip did slip a little bit, and that's because the grip is just a little bit too bulky for my taste. If you have bigger hands, if you like slightly girthier grips, it's going to be perfectly fine for you. This is not at all a criticism of the sword, the grip design, anything like that. It's just not quite right shape-wise for me, and that does affect how the sword handles for me. I feel this grip more than I do most. Most of the time when I pick up a sword, the sword just kind of melts into my hand, and I feel like it's an extension of my hand because I know how to use it. I've used a lot of swords at this point. This one, because it's bulky, I feel it there. I feel it, and it doesn't quite feel natural to hold it, to swing it, because of that girthier grip. Again, not a criticism, just something that makes this sword a little uncomfortable for me to use. I do think the percussion nodes are a legitimate criticism. I think you want it more like around here on the blade, more like around here on the grip, to minimize the concussive force, to minimize the reverberations that go through the sword and impact the hand. I think that could have been better designed. But if we talk about just moving this sword around, first off, it creates a ton of sword wind. Very loud sword, one of the loudest swords I've ever swung. So very easy to tell when your edge alignment is off. This sword will tell you that. Like if I purposefully do bad edge alignment, it still does a little bit of sword wind, but pretty much nothing like when my edge alignment is on. So very good for telling you about that. If we look at the balance point here, it is quite close to the guard. It's at 2¼ inches. So this is a very fast and nimble sword that is easy to move around. I can start a cut and redirect it very easily. Continue cuts. Just very easy to move the sword around. Very, very quick. It moves through the air very easily. And the tip, being that it is balanced so close to the guard, the tip is very maneuverable. Very easy to put where I want it to be. And, you know, what I mentioned earlier about this, I wanted this sword to be kind of like a nobleman's dueling sword. I can see that. The tip, you want to be able to direct the tip where you want it for very quick, fast, long range thrusts in a duel. So that's very effective, and that's a good way of implementing that concept. But because the sword is so heavy back in the hilt, so light out here, it has very little authority in the cut. It does me no favors in cutting, and that's exasperated by the fact that this is a very flexible sword. Not just out here towards the tip. You can see I'm barely putting any force into that. I can flex it very easily, even all the way back here in the strong of the blade, you can see it flexing. And, you know, I talked a lot about the thickness on this sword already, but it is a very thin sword, and it has all the positives of that and the negatives. And there are definitely negatives to being that thin. And in the handling, what it does is create that super light, super quick sword that is very easy to move around, very easy to deliver the tip where you want it. But it's at a cost of cutting up power, cutting authority, and the fact that when I'm moving the sword around, it's flexing mid-air just from the force of the swing, which kind of reduces its ability to deliver edge on point with good edge alignment, because if it's flexing when I'm swinging it, imagine if right here it's actually more like that, suddenly the edge alignment is off a little bit and it's less effective in the cut. So I'm going to compare this sword to two others, both of them some of my favorites in my collection. So we have here the Albion Mercenary. Now these are about 2 ounces difference, maybe 1 to 2 ounces difference. The Kopciuch is a much longer blade, longer hilt. They both have pretty hefty pommels here. So when I pick up the Mercenary, there is just so much more authority and weight to the blade in a good way. I can feel the weight in every portion of the blade. No part of it feels like it's not there. Whereas with the Kopciuch, most of the sword doesn't really have much feel to it because it is so thin and light. And if we look at this, it has barely any flex to it at all. It's got a little bit towards the end, but this is a very rigid blade and very quick and easy to move around. Still very easy to direct the tip where I want it. It's balanced, looks like to me about 3 to 3.5 inches. Just a quick measurement there. But yeah, a lot more authority in the cut while still being very focused on being able to thrust. So yeah, I pick up the Kopciuch sword again. All the weight feels in the hilt, especially this pommel, which has a lot of weight to it. I don't feel much of anything of the blade out from about halfway on. There's pretty much no weight to it at all. It's kind of a weird feeling, honestly. It makes this sword feel, I'm not sure how to describe it. It feels like it's about this long. So it just makes it such a unique feeling sword to move around. So the other sword I'm going to compare to the Kopciuch is the Vision Tauber from Valiant Armory. And you can see here, the blades are considerably more similar in length than the Mercenary. Hilt lengths, roughly similar there, maybe a little bit longer on the Kopciuch overall. This Tauber weighs around 2 pounds, 12 ounces. This one just over 3 pounds, so about a 4-ounce difference. If we pick up the Tauber, this has always, ever since I got it, been one of my absolute favorite swords. It has just the perfect balance between cut, thrust, light, nimble, but authority in the cut. You can see that it is more flexible than the Mercenary, but still a pretty stiff blade. Certainly stiffer than the Kopciuch by a lot. And it is balanced, it looks like about 4 inches from the guard. Just like the Mercenary, I feel every part of the blade. I can feel weight there. I know where the blade is at all times. The tip is definitely a little bit less nimble than the Mercenary, but not much. And just very easy to move. This is one of the most fun swords I have ever picked up. Seriously, if you have not checked out the Vision Tauber or Strasbourg, they share the same blade. You really should try to check it out if you can. Just like what I said with the Mercenary. I picked this up, I immediately feel the weight in the hilt and almost none out here in the blade. It is stark how little weight there is in this blade and how that feels in the hand. I've seen these, you'll sometimes see these like longsword trainers that are basically just a hilt with a very short stubby sword blade. They're designed for like indoor sword training, and they're designed to mimic the weight, but they can't really mimic the weight of a blade because you can't mimic that long of a blade with that much of it. So this feels a lot like those because there's so much weight in the hilt and so little in the blade. If you like super agile swords that just don't feel like they're there, this is the kind of sword that you want to get. For me personally, I do like a little bit more presence to the blade overall. All right, let's talk about some improvements that could be made to this sword, and I think Mr. Kopciuch's work in general. Now this is, again, my opinion only, but I think a little more attention to detail in the details of the commission. Like the grip shape is not correct for what I requested. The crosses that were supposed to be on the blade are not there. Mr. Kopciuch missed that I requested those in the commission, even though it was one of the first things I mentioned. And then he said he didn't think it could work that on this sword because of the double fullers. I don't understand that personally. But a little more attention to detail, a little bit more consciousness of what was requested at the start of the commission to make the sword really be exactly what I requested and envisioned. Secondly, the grip is a little bit bulky for my taste, a little bit too wide. This is not really a criticism because, again, other people will have absolutely no problem with this. This is a personal preference type of thing. So I hesitated to even bring it up, but it is something that I would have liked to see. So I'm adding in here. But the big one, the elephant in the room, the blade thickness. This sword starts at 4.5 millimeters thick, not 6 millimeters like Mr. Kopciuch listed on his website. I don't have a problem with Mr. Kopciuch making a sword that starts at 4.5 millimeters thick, even though that's pretty much on the low thickness, on the very low side of what you would have seen historically. That doesn't mean you would not have seen a sword of this type that started at that thickness, but it is definitely on the low side. Again, I don't have a problem with him wanting to make swords like that, but don't misrepresent how thick the sword is. Don't list it at 6 millimeters when it's a full 1.5 millimeters less than that. That's just disingenuous. Now, for me personally, like I said, I don't mind if Mr. Kopciuch wants to make swords like that, but that's not the type of sword I want. With a sword of this era, I want one that has more rigidity to it. So bottom line, this sword set me back about $2,500. What did I get for that price? I got one of the prettiest swords I have ever owned, bar none. This thing is gorgeous. The scabbard, in addition, is gorgeous. In fact, let's talk about the scabbard real quick. It is absolutely worth the price of around $700 to $800. That's around what the scabbard added to the cost of the sword. And it is gorgeous. It is functional. It fits the sword very, very well. The stamping on here is beautiful. I really like this shape. The hilt, all the different furniture, the conchos, the tongue here, beautiful. I love this scabbard. Absolutely worth the price. And by the way, if you haven't seen Mr. Kopciuch's more elaborate scabbards, he can do some really outrageously good stuff, including some hand painting. He did one that was, I believe, St. George. Oh, so beautiful. He has a ton of talent and a lot of artistic merit. His scabbards are gorgeous. The blade, the sword, is at that same level of beauty. I love the overall aesthetics of this sword. The only criticism I have of the actual overall profile is that the grip is a little bit wide. And in practice, for my hands, it's a little bit wide. But when you're looking at the sword overall, I do find it just looks a little bit larger than it needs to be for the profile of the sword. But yeah, beautiful sword. I love it. And it captures the aesthetic of medieval people, at least the aesthetic that I picture for medieval swords. I think this looks so authentic to the period, and that's something you don't get very often. But all that being said, it is, for me, lacking in the performance. It just doesn't cut very well. There is so little meat and anything to the blade out in the second half that it just doesn't have any authority in the cut. It's balanced very close to the guard. So it's not a cutting sword with the amount of flexibility. It's not crazy flexible. But it is definitely flexible, and it's flexible a little too close to the base for my taste. It's not going to be a particularly effective thrusting sword either. And in addition to that, I find the harmonic nodes to be a little off for my taste. I think the blade one is a little too close to the middle of the blade. The hilt one is a little too close to the middle of the grip. These are all part and parcel of the thickness of the sword. If this had a little bit more meat to it out here, it would pull the harmonic node up here, it would pull it up here and put them into the places where they're more commonly found on reproduction swords that make them more fun for my purposes. Again, this is about what I find about this sword. Other people will not care about my criticisms in that regard at all, and that's fine. Not everybody has the same requirements of what they want from a sword. If this is the type of sword that you want, it's absolutely worth the cost. But for me, at $2,500, there's two big complaints I have. One, the lack of fulfilling my requirements. The grip geometry being wrong, those crosses not being put in on the blade. And that's, at $2,500, I expect to get what I commission, not something approaching what I commissioned. And secondly, the other big complaint is the performance. I don't enjoy cutting with the sword, and I just don't really enjoy using it that much. I don't like taking it out and swinging it around that much because the blade is just so light that it doesn't feel comparable to any other sword I have. So it's not really a great training tool or practice tool for me because it would only be practicing and training for this very specific feel. And I don't have another sword that handles like this because pretty much all the other swords I have more meat and more blade presence to them. So for me personally, the performance pretty much always takes top notch over aesthetics. So while I think this is one of the prettiest swords in my collection, it just doesn't quite hit me where I want to be hit. I want that blend of aesthetics and performance. And this sword, for my tastes, is much more on the aesthetic side and doesn't really have the performance that I want out of it. That doesn't mean it's not right sword for other people, just probably not the right one for me. So in the end, in my opinion, I don't think I got quite enough for what I wanted out of this sword. But that's not to say the sword can't be worth the price. It's just my taste. I would probably go for a different maker or specify a different, get more specific about the thickness of the blade to make it more to my taste. And that's not what I did here. And I'm not so sure, given the experience that I have with him, Mr. Kopciuch, missing some of the specs on this, the delays, I'm not so sure I would want to order another sword from him. But that's just my own personal opinion. And if this sword is more to your taste and you don't mind some of the little niggling issues I pointed out, then sure, I highly recommend you check out and perhaps commission a sword from Mr. Kopciuch. And that's going to wrap up this extra long review. I haven't put it all together and done video editing yet, but I am reasonably confident this is going to be the longest review I have done to date. If you managed to sit through all of it, thank you very much. And if you have and you somehow aren't subscribed yet, make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment, do all that stuff. YouTube wants you to do it. Until next time, Alien Toot out.